Welcome. Welcome to episode 18, the final episode of Reading to Mom. My name is Joe, the publisher, the elated publisher at Historia Research near Printers Row in Chicago, Illinois. We haven't received many reviews on this work, but there's one that I, as a publisher, appreciate. The money quote is, "If George R.R. Martin and Herodotus held a writing seminar, this dense account of an imaginary land might be the result." I keep this quote on the wall so that the author must see it every time he visits me. The author foolishly thinks this is a compliment, yet nobody wants to find themselves in a writing seminar when they expect to be carried away by reading a high fantasy. It makes me chuckle knowing that only an author as dense as this historical fiction could read that as a compliment. For the last time, allow me to introduce the author reading to his mother. Hi, Mom. In the 2 years since publication, I've been fortunate to have received only a positive review. The line that I appreciate most states that the great historical sweep of the entire book and the account of Sidra's quest for the talismanic Archon are richly imagined and lavishly depicted. I like to keep this quote on the wall so that my publisher has to see it every time he visits me. I find that this quote acknowledges the immense scope and ambitiousness of my entire project. Now, some, like my publisher, would prefer a minor bit of escapism without much bearing on what the reader has come to understand about the arcane world. I, for one, believe it is better to study history with an eye to what it may mean for our future. Keep this in mind as you read or listen to Chapter 17, an analytical chapter that seeks to tie together the loose ends between the historical narrative of the Provenance and the personal journey of Sidra. The great historical mystery of the age is, of course, was Sidra the sorcerer of Tityos? Thus, I spend the final chapter in an examination of this very question by means of consideration for the arcane world's approach to life and death, and in particular, resurrection, or raising the dead. Ultimately, now that you are an initiate and a history buff of the Arcane Age, it's up to you to determine for yourself if Sidra was or was not the sorcerer of Tityos. Whichever you choose, I hope you've enjoyed this reading of Arcane Cage, being a historical narrative of fantastic events during the decline and fall of the Provenance. As the pandemic is not yet over, I wish you to take care, and I love you. Chapter 17, Epilogues, or Histories as written by the victors. Sidra may have died in combat outside of the gates of the Acropolis that day, but she narrowly escaped death after Kivon's true shot at Oron's mercenary gave her a second chance at life along the border of the West Lyman. When the Dynasties followed his troops from out of the Acropolis, Suntekanax and her clerical votaries also emerged from the gates to tend the wounded and dying. After surveying the fallen, the Master Cleric directed her charges to treat the injured Acropolitan soldiers, while she took personal responsibility for the care of the High Council's cleric. Suntekanax promptly resurrected Sidra, and restored her to health. In her private journal, Sidra recorded a few personal thoughts about her return to the living.
As my senses returned to me, I gradually made out the welcome, stern face of the master cleric, and over her shoulder the dynasties of the Acropolis. I knew immediately that Prajana had survived her mission, and that our plan to draw out the wanderer who sought the Archon had succeeded. I smiled more widely than I ever had, as one by one I found that every member of my Sum had somehow survived the final conflict. As I began to roll over to lift myself off the ground, a hand darted out and grabbed me up by my breastplate to stand me up. It was Eosh, triumphant and I dare say pleased to see me. No sooner did she let go of me than Matna, my fair-haired barbarian, barking with delight at my return, lifted me off the ground in a Nella's hug that nearly squeezed the life from me a second time. After the display shown by the two passionate philosophers of our Sum, the reasonable members collapsed on us to form one intimate huddle in spite of our untreated injuries. We expressed our gratitude to each other and our joy at witnessing each other's well-being. My early missteps and the deceptions I used to expose the wanderer notwithstanding, I had earned the respect and admiration of my fellow Arcanists as a philosopher and a leader. They now welcomed me as one with them, and I now wished to join them on the border between the Provenance and the Lyman. Sadly, some time passed before I realized that Tigris did not join in our gaiety. He stood to our side, the lifeless remains of his Paradrykos Katidios slumped in the cradle of his forearms. He shed a single tear, a rarity for the reasonable wizards of Agrigento, that ran down his cheek and fell onto the fur of his dead marten. I gestured to show my condolences and to acknowledge my mistake. Our Sum has suffered an agonizing loss this day.
As previously alluded to, aside from the private entries noted above, Sidra deliberately hid or omitted the fate of the Archon in her later reports to the High Council. Likewise, her colleagues, Kivon and Tigris, neglected to shed light on what transpired in the days after Sidra's return to life near the gates of the Acropolis. While it seems clear that Metanastus and his co-conspirators failed to seize the Archon to aid them in the effort to unite the Lyman against the Provenance, the existing records reveal nothing more about the security or deployment of what may rightfully be identified as the most powerful artifact of the Arcane Age. Historians have a long tradition of reading the archives with a third eye. Invariably, the historical documents that survived bloody conflicts and palace intrigues have the sanction of those who prevailed. In the rare cases when documents written by the hand of the vanquished resurface or are preserved, the victors often saw value in airing or caricaturing the defeated ideals of their former challengers. In these cases, hubris or disdain, as the case may be, provides a distorted window through which to see the fate of a lost civilization or an unsuccessful political ideology. More frequently, however, the victors neglect to write any history at all, preferring to mask the origin of their ascendancy in obscurity, and lend their authority the distinction of having existed since prehistory, or the beginning of recorded time. In such circumstances, nary an account is found to explain the most intriguing and wondrous spectacles in history. From the victor's perspective, history records nothing more than a chronology of divine interventions on their behalf, and, as with the preternatural godheads, delivers a silent testament to their unchallengeable authority. While the Metanastus scroll, as the title suggests, preoccupies itself with bits of history and legend regarding the Wanderer, who sought to unite the West Lyman against the Provenance, the document also provides a few suggestive hints as to the fate of the Archon and the identity of Sidra. The problem confronting scholars of arcane history, however, is this: did the victors or the vanquished draft the Metanastus scroll? The Provenance and its forces exposed Metanastus' subterfuge and repelled his initial attempt to retrieve the Archon for himself. As the timeline of the Arcane Age reveals, however, both Sidra and the Provenance would not long survive. See illustration 11. Illustration 11. Timeline of notable Arcane Age events. From left to right, the Arcane Age is divided into 11 epochal primes, or periods of 137 years. Many of the significant events discussed in this work are noted along this timeline. In particular, at the right, the construction of the Acropolis in the 9th epoch, the introduction of half-Orga as free denizens in the 10th epoch, and of course, the events surrounding the dynasties in Sidron, preceding the First Great War and the end of the Arcane Age. End illustration 11. The Arcane Age as we now know it ended in the continental conflagration known as the First Great War. Events had already been set in motion, for which Sidra was complicit, if innocent. That augured the collapse of the Provenance and the loss of the classical powers. Thus, the question remains, was the Metanastis scroll a desperate attempt by the vanquished to incriminate the architect of their demise? Or was the scroll the product of a prideful conqueror who wished to establish a legacy for the decline and fall of the Provenance for posterity? Unfortunately, the competitive nature of modern scholarship and ease with which the most amateurish researchers may self-publish their work has left this author at a disadvantage. The editors of the Journal of the Early Provenance, JEP for short, saw fit to rush to publication a special issue on the Metanastis scroll, greatly diminishing the novelty of this work and the story it tells. Footnote 1. Pamela G.A. Thomas, editor of Deciphering the Metanastis Scroll, Journal of the Early Provenance, Volume 131, Number 4, a special issue, published in 953 of the Golden Age, on pages 617 to 769. End footnote. The damage from the Western chauvinism and solipsistic conclusions of lesser scholars cannot easily be undone. One can only hope, in light of the temperate and collegial responses to the special edition, that the reading public and librarians will have the good sense, as one critic noted, not to waste precious book purchasing funds on a volume which should not have progressed past the stage of manuscript review. Footnote 2. In his specious assertion that Tigris authored the Metanastis scroll, the JEP presents a perfect example of the universality principle in the decipherment of texts, wherein a philologist or linguist rashly presumes that his or her translation of one text provides a key to the translation of other texts. Whereas the Metanastis scroll utilizes many logograms in the Elvish language found in the Demotic Lyman, the inference that the wizard penned the later scroll does not stand up to scrutiny. The most obvious error, of course, is that Tigris may have copied or translated an original and now lost text composed by another arcane philosopher, in which case the text may not reflect the sign system of a single person or even a single language, but that of several different chronologists, creating such complex circumstances for the decipherment of the scroll that the best interpretations are mere suppositions. Despite the brazen and insufferable arrogance of the JEP issue, the unknowns connected to the Metanastis scroll are still far greater than those once associated with the decipherment of the Demotic Lyman and other arcane verses only recently translated into modern language. End footnote. As there is no wish to lend more credence to the travesties forwarded in the special issue of the JEP, the conclusion to this work will not rehash the content or debate the problems therefrom. As I have personally translated key passages from the historical document in question to enlarge on Sidra's biography, the epilogue will address a few loose ends in the narrative that may be nagging at the modern reader. To it, how, if at all, did the events unfolding at the Acropolis in the West Lyman contribute to the sudden collapse of the Provenance and the end of the Arcane Age? What happened to the Archon following the battle outside the gates of the Acropolis? And lastly, was Sidra a latter-day incarnation of the sorcerer? The latter question will be taken up first as a precondition for rightly exploring the other two. How a people value life and death says more about the philosophical bent of the culture than almost any other aspect of their beliefs and practices. In this regard, like so many others, the peoples of the Arcane Age set themselves apart in world history. Although the threat of irreversible death under the crushing blow of an enemy's mace had passed, Sidra succumbed to the process of dying called Kriokopia, the canceling of debts, in her time. The idea had its origins in the preternatural age, when life and death were relatively simple concepts that served the purposes of the divine powers. In short, the Godheads popularized the notion that the peoples of the domain owed them for the privilege of existence. As if an aspect of administrative power, the Godheads fostered a sense of injustice in the material fact of existence and accorded merit to a life lived in subservience to the will of a superior being. Every subject of the Godheads lived on borrowed time, such as it was, that the Godhead alone determined how to expend. In life, there was no reprieve from this indebtedness to the Godheads, and only in death could the debt be cancelled. Following Agrigentum, the understanding of life and death became more nuanced for a new age. Arcane wisdom taught that the four elements were complete and eternal in themselves, and as Agrigentum wrote, nothing adds to them, nothing passes away. The adage had a twofold effect on the arcane understanding of life and death. First, life did not add materially to the basic substance of the universe, and no one person's life diminished from the richness and diversity of the ceaselessly changing cosmos. There was no debt for life, per se, or even for consuming the basic necessities of life. Second, death served to return the material elements of nature back to their primordial origin, in full, and in this release emancipated the elements to foster new life, or freeing. Reversing the preternatural Godhead's design, the canceling of debts meant to the arcane peoples that nothing was owed to the dead and that the living had free rein to pursue life's trials. The general population of the Provenance thus saw mortal life as a natural process of the primordial elements that define the purpose and ceaseless activity of the universe without reverence for immortality or reference to a single divine agency as the prime mover. A key question, however, remained: what to make of mortal life in general, or more specifically, the quality of an individual life in the weighty chains of mortality. In the preternatural age, only the Godheads truly enjoyed what we moderns call personhood. The cities single-mindedly tended to the qualities and indulgences of immortal life. Panthemus, hex of the Godhead of Naxos, through this lens, then offers the first historical record of a mortal aspiring to more than labor and the reproduction of labor on behalf of a higher power, or ruling class. Following the advent of the classical powers shortly thereafter, aspirations for a quality of life beyond mere existence became more acceptable and commonplace, as the middling class of arcanists, mechanics, and merchants carved out new standards of living and ideals for comfort. As the drive for personal comforts has only grown exponentially with time, our golden age, in this sense, is the great gift that Panthema bestowed upon the world when she made a single grand refusal to worship any godhead or serve any principle without care for her own particular miserable lifetime. The clerical power to raise the dead thoroughly complicated the basic notions of life and death that had solidified the Godhead's hold on human life in the preternatural age. On the one hand, resurrection seemingly transferred the debt of life to the one who resurrected the dying. In this respect, the Godhead of Naxos reacted to its own cure from Panthemus' hex by summarily killing the world's first cleric in order to snuff out the idea that a Godhead may be indebted to a mere mortal, noble or otherwise. On the other hand, death canceled all debts, and the hope for a life beyond death to a Godhead undermined the very purpose of divinity. The Godheads correctly presumed, therefore, that the commoners' clerics who first learned to raise the dead presented a clear and present threat that would usurp divine power and end deistic worship among the masses. In the Provenance, the aspirations unleashed by Panthema, and no longer subject to the containment by the Godheads, proved to be both personal and social in nature, and rooted in the reality and regularity of resurrections. In point of fact, resurrection became the foundational concept of life and death in the Arcane Age. As nothing adds to or passes away in the primordial order of the four elements, the arcane people construed an individual life as a chain link in the continuous procession of resurrections. Footnote 3. This is not to say reincarnations in the modern sense, in which the personality or ego of a single individual seemingly transcends socio-historical conditions. The contemporary longing for reincarnation reflects a certain kind of egoism in modern life that quickens the tensions between a society and its individuals. An individual capable of seeing oneself as the reincarnation of former lives raises a wall of self-sufficiency in their own being that further contributes to the isolation of individuation. Flitting through the social contingencies of world history, the reincarnated soul is something like a pop-up vendor who peddles self-importance along the streets of grave and seminal events. Arcane resurrection, properly understood, requires no such egoism. End footnote. As nothing adds to or passes away in the primordial order of the four elements, the arcane peoples construed an individual life as a chain link in the continuous procession of resurrections. Thus, whereas the arcanes attributed material existence to the eternal commingling of the four elements, immaterial life, mortal resurrection, derived meaning from its point of entry into the course of world history and its ability to recognize how best to serve as midwife to the moment pregnant with its own possibility. Chronology. Furthermore, most cultures in the domain understood the classical powers as something like a special case in the life-giving commingling of elements. This is not to say that a single uniform idea of resurrection animated the mind of the arcanes, as it was the case that each arcane philosophy of the passions, or reason, offered a distinct take on resurrection and contributed a unique perspective on the intersections of life, democracy, and arcane philosophy. A full review of all 12 lifestyles of resurrection is unnecessary, since consideration for clerics in particular will provide my committed readers some insight into Sidra's experience with resurrection near the gates of the Acropolis. For the clerics, who possessed the power to heal as well as to raise the dead, there was nothing particularly miraculous or damning about resurrection as compared to more minor feats in the classical power. As Sidra expressed in her journal,
Those who regard resurrection as a divine or denuding act evidently do so out of ignorance or in a state of wonder for the strange manifestation of undeath.
the clerical wisdom held that the four elements offered boundless potential, such that each individual person or thing formed its own unique entity and an infinite possibility of personages. While unique, no individual was regarded as especially sacred or inviolable, as nature composed them from the elements, and each organism ends by returning to the elements from which it was composed. Physical maladies replicated life and death in the stages of resurrection, in that the causes and cures for illness indicated the passing of elements into and out of bodies, promoting or combating the conditions that permitted life to flourish. As both health and illness, like life and death, were elemental forces in a constant flux between harmony and strife with each other, the boundaries of individuality were constantly blurred by the actions and reactions of the natural processes in the universe. A cleric's primary duty was then to enlist the cooperation of the patient, the classical powers, and external factors into the limitless potential of coming to be, or, in arcane terminology, to care for well-being in a broad sense, without the aesthetic pretensions of rogues or the fascist inclinations of godheads. Footnote 4. In contrast, for the rogues, resurrection closely aligned with the concept of transgression, in that they understood life as an act of desire originating in the toisis, vehement emotion, of the friend. In this regard, they did not conceive transgression as injustice against a lawful or unchanging order, as the godheads claimed, but as the beating heart of a world eternally coming to be. The individual life transgressed of its own accord, self-actualizing by necessity against what was and what is, in order to resurrect what will be. Death then marked a transition from being the transgressor to becoming the transgressed, in a ceaselessly changing universe. Needless to say, the worldview of the rogues was very subjective, emotional, and aesthetic, as Scotanus exemplifies. They ridiculed those who longed for permanency, lawful order, or afterlife as exhibiting the symptoms of a will too weak to transgress against life and death. To emphasize the point, many rogues, who suffered the indignity of resurrection at the hands of a cleric, chose to retire under the mark of death, and to spend the rest of their lives in the shadows. In this, the rogues seem to accept the implication that raising the dead by clerical wisdom sapped the desire for life from the resurrected. In other words, life lasted only as long as, in arcane terms, the friend was stout. If one's friend lacked the stoutness to escape ignominious death, to use Eosha's phrase, no greater destiny awaited the resurrected rogue, and an honorable code of conduct dictated that the rogue submit to endless transgressions. End footnote. Given the significance of resurrection to the arcane peoples, and generally those in the Provenance, Sidra's experience with death at the hands of the conspirator, Metanastus, and with new life from the hands of an ally who she had accused of treason, Suntekanax, afflicted her acutely. For most of her life, she had known herself to be an arcanist who commingled elements to control classical powers. To lose her life was also to lose her distinction as an arcanist, and as she wrote in her personal journal,
I know now what it is to be a commoner on the Wayfarer's Trail.
She intended her observation as praise for the common class, a revelation of empathy for the ones she cared for without necessarily feeling a deep connection during her journey west. She had spent the final weeks of her appointment at the Acropolis engaged in aspersions and conspiracies against the Master Cleric, who did not hesitate in the least to return her to life. In her words, she recognized that her suspicions of the dynasties and Suntekanax reflected the hubris of an attaché of the High Council, who had lost sight of the shared responsibility of citizenship.
Mine was an assigned duty in service to a lawful order, but it was only that, an assignment in the larger project of the Provenance. More importantly, I know what it means to be a commoner who owes her subsequent life to an arcanist.
Sidra noted. As an apprentice to a prestigious member of the High Council, Sidra largely had enjoyed the wealth of the Provenance from a privileged position. The chambers of the High Council gave her a certain impression of the arcanist's prominence in the domain. At the mercy of another cleric, however, she discovered that there was more to the relationship between arcanists and commoners, as conveyed by the popular adage, no kindness or coin ever repaid the debt owed to a cleric. Footnote 5. The Cone Oath that came to mind during Sidra's journey along the Wayfarer's Trail many months earlier. End footnote. Like resurrection and the classical power, Sidra now recognized democracy shared the basic structure of a continuous process of commingling elements that constituted the Commonwealth as a precondition to individuality. With her undying breath, a simple idea occurred to her.
Without one, the eternal and unchanging elements of self-governance, the other, the many facets of personal liberty, fail to exist.
Sidra's reflections on her mortality and democracy would of course be of little account if she had not possessed the Archon at the time she fell outside of the gates of the Acropolis, or if the entombed ranger had not made the suggestive revelation that Sidra may well have been the next sorcerer of the domain. For, aside from the details extrapolated from the Metanastis scroll, and the few doubts expressed in Sidra's journal, the arcane technology created as an instrument to influence the common masses to follow a despotic leader remarkably disappeared from world history for the second, and, we can only hope, for the last time. The proposition that Sidra was the reincarnation of the sorcerer in character or will, friend, is on the face of it a preposterous idea. Certainly it is not an idea that she herself entertained seriously in the additional time given to her after the confrontation with Metanastis. As her brush with death had renewed her commitment to the arcane wisdom of the clerics, she knew well that each friend or life was unique to the moment in which it exercised its natural powers to commingle the elements. This uniqueness, however, was not absolute or innate, but relative to the points at which the friend or life entered into or exited from world history. The best a person may do was to pick up a spear thrown by those who came before and chuck it a little bit further, and within the reach of those who inevitably will follow. In simple terms, Sidra had no conceptual framework, such as the soul or the ego, with which to see herself as a preternatural godhead or demon who had returned in order to subjugate the known world to her will. These considerations, however, deflect from the more important question of what it meant for Sidra to be a close enough approximation to the sorcerer, as the entombed ranger characterized it, that the Archon showed its care for her and submitted to her control. As the four elements, or the substance of the universe, were used and reused for the sustenance of mortal life, the possibility exists that Sidra's elemental constitution matched, in an arcane sense, the elemental constitution of the sorcerer. Whereas their two immaterial freen form two unique entities per clerical wisdom, the composition of their corporeal forms may share the same basic elements of life in whole or in part. Alternatively, approximation may not mean that Sidra and the sorcerer shared the exact same elemental particles, but that their configuration or commingling of the elements made them an indiscernible pair to the Archon. If in the former case Sidra was the resurrected elements of the sorcerer, then her appointment to the Acropolis in the West Lyman presents a major coincidence in the entire course of the Arcane Age. Had she not been present in the West Lyman, it seems unlikely that another close approximation to the sorcerer would have been present to recover the Archon from its watery prison in the final years of the Arcane Age. In light of these circumstances, the young cleric's selection as the attaché of the High Council to the Acropolis was no accident, nor was her introduction to the many arcanists who sought to enlist her in their own causes. Perhaps not every person may be counted as a calculating agent in the recovery of the Archon, but certainly more than a handful of agents under the command of Metanastis knew, as well as members of Sidra's own Zoom. Eosh clearly gamed the course of events when she used her furtive skills to obtain the magical dust that revealed the thousand-year-old tomb of the Archon. Her initial effort to seize the Archon for herself also demonstrates her foreknowledge of its powers. The more intriguing suspicion, nonetheless, rests with the role of Tigress in the artifact's recovery. As an elf, who long studied in Agrigentum's tower, it is quite possible that Tigress knew the reasons for the High Council's choice, or even had a hand in the decision to send Sidra to the Acropolis. Her first account of the elf's actions often suggests that he knew something of the Archon long before it became the focus of her Soon. In the final contest of wills before the gates, he also seemed to put Sidra's intentions to the test as much as he used the opportunity to size up the interloper, Metanastus. The proper respect for his true purpose and alignment, therefore, is crucial to the attribution of authorship to the Metanastus scroll, his authorship to the Metanastus scroll. Lastly, the subject of Sidra's material approximation to the sorcerer lends itself to one further disconcerting possibility. Previous analysis has assumed the sorcerer is deceased, and that his elemental constitution has passed back to the indeterminate primordial order to be resurrected by subsequent life. Yet, what if the sorcerer had never perished? Certainly, long life was not unheard of, as the elves were believed to live indefinitely, unless struck down in battle or by other unnatural causes. If that is the case, the question of whether Sidra was a sorcerer reincarnated would have made even less sense than it does in the simple application of arcane philosophy to the nature of resurrection, i.e., she most certainly was an approximation in a formal arrangement, not in material elements. One peculiarity of the preternatural and arcane lore of the Godheads is that not one of the divine rulers may be said to have died or ceased to exist in the mortal sense. The Godhead of Paline perhaps comes closest, as it was sent to a fiery end in the volcanic furnace of the Ferris Mountains. The trembling ground beneath our feet during earthquakes, however, the arcanes imagine to be the vengeance that the Godhead of Paline occasionally visited on faithless free persons. 5, the large majority of the Godheads, had been transformed into the Dragons of Blue, before being cast beyond the horizon of the four Limans and into the starry sky above. And the 7th, the Godhead of Panoptes, simply had been banished from the city after the Glorious Revolution, before passing from the annals of history henceforth. In like manner, the sorcerer of Tityos has no beginning or end in the mythology and records of the Arcane Age. After appearing suddenly on the stage of civil war between the Godheads and the commoners, he moved quickly to solidify his hold over the Daemon. While the Provenance may be said to have repelled the advances of his dragons, it is not accurate to say the First Republic defeated the sorcerer. In the earliest epoch of the Arcane Age, it appears, the sorcerer retired in the West, where he fashioned a new instrument of conquest, the Archon, and took on a new name, Archelaus. Then again, after his defeat to a coalition of rangers, rogues, and druids, according to the long-lived guardian in the Watery Temple, the sorcerer was forced from Tityos for his past depredations. Like the immortal godheads, the sorcerer of Tityos slips out of history and memory for many, many generations, before making one brief and confounding reappearance, if only in name, in the waning epoch of the Arcane Age. So, the question is, what if the sorcerer of Tityos somehow possessed immortality? As noted above, per the sage observation of Winston Churchill, history is written by the victors, but the events and stories the victors elect not to tell hold the secrets to their true power. In that the sorcerer of Tityos passed from history entirely for several millenniums, it may be inferred that he preferred, or prefers, that his very existence be forgotten by humankind. If so, the Metanastus scroll and certain details that fall outside our modest history about the deeds of a late champion of the Provenance definitely was not the product of a boastful victor eager to transmit his deeds to posterity. To the contrary, if the sorcerer be immortal, and his victory over the Provenance and arcane philosophy absolute, he cleverly devised his absence during the final years of the Arcane Age as a means to conceal his invisible hand in the course of world history. And finally, though the Provenance became the great spark that lit 1,000 civilizations, democracies often burn bright but fast in world history, keeping subject the greater part of the globe's population in the inhumane despotisms of monarchs and autocrats who claim the divine right to rule. Thus, an immortal sorcerer hidden in the shadows of world history fostering mortal misery and penitence is not as fantastically far-fetched as it may at first appear to the uninitiated historian. These thoughts lead by deductive steps to Sidra and the Archon. The early arcanists who opposed the sorcerer of Tityos and seized the artifact appear to have regarded it as imperishable. Rather than destroy the object, they went to great lengths to conceal its existence and whereabouts from future generations. The artifice worked for centuries until, like the sorcerer of Tityos, the Archon made a brief reappearance in what became the last years of the Arcane Age. In contrast to the invisible hand of the sorcerer, the Archon did not seem to play a significant role in the events leading to the fall of Provenance, thereby making the exact nature and power of the artifact the subject of heated debates in academic circles today. In addition to being imperishable, the artifact also was believed to have a friend or a will of its own to select who wielded its power. While not a large sample, the Archon had the chance to show its care for each member of Sidra's Zoom. Whatever approximation may have meant to the Arcanists, it is striking that an artifact created to inspire fear and adulation rejected the calculating desires of Eosh, the panting vengeance of Matna, and the ferocity of Rajana. The stoic wizard Tigris, whose elvish longevity and self-possessed learnedness may have combined with the artifact to form an indomitable friend, the artifact also passed over. While the Archon presented itself as an impossible weight to bear for the other members of the Zoom, Sidra alone had both the vigor and boldness to lift the object up off its pedestal. In her heavy-handed efforts to harness the power of the Archon and exercise control over others, Sidra showed herself to be far less adept. Whereas the entombed rangers seemed to taunt and mock her commands to be silent, the confrontation outside the gates of the Acropolis present more serious questions about the cleric's ability to abuse the powers of the Archon. If Sidra possessed the ability to control the will of others with the object in hand, why did she allow events to descend into a bloody conflict with Metanastus and his beguiled followers? If not the Wanderer directly, she surely must have had an instrument to redirect Oron and the commoners who defended the gates. Flipping the allegiance of a few provincial soldiers and sentries in the final analysis clearly would have been enough to escape her temporary demise. Certainly the possibility exists, as one article in the JEP's special edition on the Metanastus scroll suggests, that Sidra staged the struggle and her own death in order to earn the trust of the dynasty and to gain entry to the Acropolis with the Archon in her possession. In the guise of the High Council's cleric, the sorcerer of Tityos covertly ruled the Acropolis while uniting the cultures of the Lyman against the Provenance. When the moment was right, she betrayed the Acropolitans and joined forces with the cultures of the Lyman. Marching at the head of her liminal allegiance, Sidra later crushed the militias of the Provenance and drove the last known Arcanist in the domain to the shores of the tempestuous ocean. In short, the Council's attaché, who meticulously recorded encounters and events at the Acropolis, orchestrated the single greatest hoax in world history. But of course, sophomoric speculation is no substitute for archival research and learnedness. The reason scholars spend hundreds of hours in the archives, reading and rereading arcane texts, is to discover the little nuances in a document that testify to its authorship and its author's intentions. In Sidra's journals and her reports to the councils, we have in our possession extemporaneous writings about the events that transpired at the Acropolis in the Arcane Age's final hours. She composed her records without the foresight of her place on the side of the victorious or the vanquished. She was, as it were, a witness to history as much as one of its many agents. For this, we must be grateful at the least to have had an authentic eye and a sincere voice to chronicle the then inconclusive outcome of the mounting discord between the Provenance and the West Lyman. More importantly, when a single author leaves behind a collection of writings and documentation over a period of time, the character and the personal growth of that individual shine through the record of events, regardless of which side they eventually find themselves on, victor or vanquished, testifying to the good, if at times chaotic, character of our subject. The thoughts and self-doubts revealed in her writings show that Sidra upheld her commitment to the arcane philosophy of the clerics and took from her experiences an immense care for the legacy of the Provenance. She became an unreserved protagonist of its democratic order and grew to respect the common weal among arcanists and commoners. Nature's quintessence, Agrigentum declared, as the guarantor that the endless play of resurrections from out of the four elements affirmed human life, liberty, and the virtues of stout freeing. In fact, given a little time in the stacks, Occam's razor tells us that she was no architect of a great ruse in world history, but one of the greatest champions of Provenantial liberty. If one accepts the first proposition, Sidra's relation to the sorcerer of Tityos and the circumstances surrounding the disappearance of the Archon are not as mysterious as they may first seem. Sidra's approximation to the sorcerer was something like a complementarity or supersymmetry, such that the two formed an elemental pairing. On the one hand, Sidra was a double or a doppelganger of the sorcerer in all respects, except in the unique aspect of her own frenetic disposition. On the other hand, she was unable to call upon the powers of the Archon because she was unwilling to wield the artifact for its intended use, to become an unappeasable godhead. From this angle of analysis, we can see that the cleric was the instrument that neutralized the power of the Archon, and that she may have existed for no greater purpose than to end the threat of the sorcerer of Tityos for good. But then, as Sidra was no despot or deity, she did not have the power to destroy that which was or is indestructible, nor to extinguish the dark forces at work in human history. If she had, her best course of action would have been to smash the Archon and announce to the world that the power of the sorcerer to quell the commons had been undone. If we presume, therefore, that the Archon is imperishable, then the cleric had little choice but to bury it as well as all knowledge of its existence, so that its terror did not plague future ages in world history. Whether soon after returning to the Acropolis or when later events demanded, Sidra secreted away the most powerful artifact of the Arcane Age and hid it in a location that remains, to this day, unknown. Admittedly, now that the Archon's existence is once again familiar to humankind, there is a temptation to look further into her actions. Did Sidra entrust the artifact to others as the entombed ranger advised? Do her journals reveal anything about her subsequent travels? What happened to Metanastus after his escape from the battlefield? In these harmless thoughts, we must ask ourselves, what is the purpose of our inquiry? No doubt, more than a few who learn and read for the first time about the Archon and the resurrections of the sorcerer imagine what it would be like to find the artifact and become a modern-day incarnation of preternatural despotism. Many more, however, entertain thoughts of submission to a godhead who cannot be resisted and whose absolute power absolves all subjects from the burdens of self-governance and liberty. Therein we do well to apprehend the true nature of the Archon and the genius of the sorcerer of Tityos. In his absence from the annals of history and the subsequent loss of the Archon, the sorcerer created nostalgia for the godheads and the deceptive expectation of a return to greatness under the stomping boot of divinity. For those who suffer from the rotting heart of resentment for the mortal responsibilities for freedom, and who seek salvation in godly despotisms and monarchies on earth. The uncertainty of his origins, his identity, and existence holds the seeds of possibility for his return, with the Archon in hand to command the worshipful masses. The sorcerer of Tityos, a mind flayer of the highest order, whose ability to enthrall feeble freemen remains unmatched, has left open an invitation for each of us to follow his leads to the fathomless source of despotism and to succumb to imprisonment in his preternatural cage. The end. And this concludes Arcane Cage, being a historical narrative of fantastic events during the decline and fall of the Provenance.